Good afternoon. My name is Liz Deepers and I'm hosting this webinar on behalf of ARACY and UNICEF Australia. Thank you for joining us. We're meeting today on the unceded sovereign lands of Aboriginal people. We acknowledge traditional custodians and their enduring connection to its lands, waters and skies. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. In solidarity, ARACY supports the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the need for truth-telling about the history and the impact of colonisation. We treasure the rich and diverse cultures and customs of First Nation people, valued knowledge holders, leaders, and partners in creating the conditions for all our children to thrive. Please feel free to acknowledge the country you're joining us from in the chat. So today we are excitedly launching a new paper, the Learning Deep Dive that flows on from our introduction to the Australian Children Wellbeing Index. So in mid-2021, ARACY and UNICEF Australia came together to launch the Australian Wellbeing Index. Australia currently lacks a national data set which tracks the holistic wellbeing of children. At a time when the Australian government is taking a welcome approach to expanding the scope of budgets beyond purely economic means, the need for a comprehensive data set tracking the wellbeing of children is more urgent than ever. The Wellbeing Index is a comprehensive look at the available data to describe how Australian children and young people are faring, and the report ultimately aims to set policy priorities and guide action to ensure Australia is an equitable place to grow up and improve outcomes for all Australian children. It's aligned with ARACY's The Nest, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, and UNICEF's global goals. It provides a holistic picture of how children are faring in different aspects of their lives, such as health, education, safety, rights, and participation. By using this data to measure and track children's progress over time, we're able to provide a pulse check of both wellbeing now, as well as forecasted wellbeing in the future. Beyond measurement and decision making, what this index provides is an important accountability tool. It can help focus our attention. Over time, we'll be able to clearly see where we're making progress and where progress is stagnating. This to help create positive change for Australian children and young people. We need to understand where we're doing well and which areas need more attention to help Australian children thrive. So whilst it's important to have a holistic view of wellbeing and to look to better understand how these areas interact, the index allows us to see the fuller picture of life for Australian children. The examination of core data sets, along with expert commentary and analysis, helps us to understand where our efforts are best placed to ensure every Australian child enjoys a good life. Being able to highlight different aspects from the index and build a clearer picture around what the data is telling us is an important part of understanding our world and developing new policy responses. So therefore, it's beneficial for us to undertake specific deep dives to help understand what the emerging issues are and the changes we can make in certain areas. The papers address questions like, what are the key trends? Where are we going well? Where are we progressing? Why? Where are we lagging? Why are we lagging there? What are the emerging challenges? And what needs to happen to unlock a better future for all Australian children? The first deep dive was released in November 2023 and it explored data from the healthy domain. Today, we're excited to launch the second paper in this series, which further examines the index. The paper explores the data as it relates to the learning domain. Empowering Young Minds, a review of Australian children and young people's learning and education has been launched today. Education and learning are fundamental rights for every child. as stipulated by the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. However, not all children have equal access to quality, inclusive education and learning. There are persistent disparities across educational outcomes from different groups of children. This includes children and young people from low socioeconomic backgrounds, regional and remote communities, and those from First Nations backgrounds. These children can face multiple barriers to accessing and participating in education and learning, such as poverty, discrimination, lack of resources and support, and geographical isolation. The paper examines the data of learning and education for Australian children, highlighting the key indicators, providing a snapshot of where we're doing well and where we need to improve in 3 age categories: the antenatal period, antenatal and early childhood period, the middle years, and young people. In doing so, we aim to highlight the evidence and policy areas that need critical focus to support positive long-term outcomes for the children in the learning domain. Excuse me. So with that, where is Australia doing well? The paper found that participation in early childhood education and care, also known as ECEC, has increased in the last decade, with nearly half of 1-year-olds and 9 in 10 4-year-olds now enrolled in some early childhood education and care. Australian Early Development Census, AEDC, data shows that most Australian children starting school, 55% of them, are on track developmentally. Another strength is the current federal government focus on the early years, with their development and launch of the 10-year early years strategy, which will create a more integrated and holistic approach to the early years, with the hope to better support the education, well-being and development of Australia's children. We also found that 9 in 10 young Australians aged 20 to 24 have attained Year 12, Certificate 3 or higher. That 72% of 5 to 14-year-olds read for pleasure, and that Australia performs above the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, average in Program for International Student Development, PISA, and has fewer underperforming students than the OECD average. Australia's relative international performance as measured by PISA improved between 2018 and 2022. So we've highlighted the positives. There are still some areas where we're not doing so well, where we're lagging. 6 million children live in childcare deserts. ECEC deserts impact access to learning, particularly in rural and remote and regional communities. In Australia, there are more than twice as many children as ECEC places. That's nearly 6 million Australians, close to 1 in 4 living in childcare deserts. That figure includes more than 680,000 people living in areas with no access to early childhood education and care at all. A childcare desert is defined as when there's more than one childcare place available for every 3 children. 2024 NAPLAN results showed that 1 in 3 children are not proficient in their numeracy or literacy, leaving Australia well behind their international peer. Results also show divisions between genders, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, and between students of varying socio-economic backgrounds. Australia is also experiencing record attrition rates in universities, with overall numbers down 13% since 2016. We're also facing chronic ECEC workforce shortages, which are impacting the cost and availability of placements. Temporary waivers for staff are at an all-time high, with 9% of the national population of ECEC services currently operating with an approved temporary staffing waiver. This gives them permission to go over the required ratio of qualified educators to children. School attendance rates have also been falling over the past decade, with rates for students in years 1 to 10 at 89%. Students between the ages of 5 and 19 years old are citing that their top concern is school stress. So from the data, we've been able to identify that there are 3 emerging challenges for children's learning. The first is the cost of living crisis. It's impacting access to learning and education, putting pressures on children's education at risk, with many families finding it hard to afford school essentials and rising costs adding to the significant educational challenges already faced by children experiencing disadvantage and inequity. Climate change and disaster are impacting children, and young people are more susceptible to poorer education outcomes following life-changing climate events. And third, the digital divide and AI. Generative AI offers incredible opportunities for students' learning and education. However, it also poses risks to children's safety, privacy, security, and could contribute to greater inequality in learning access and outcomes. So we've highlighted 5 key areas for action. We need to drive a step change in the education system that will align with the 5 core principles of the Reinventing Australian Schools research for the better, well-being, health and learning of every child. We need to tackle inequality by ensuring that all children and young people have access to a high quality education, irrespective of their circumstances, background, or where they live. Currently, remote and regional disadvantaged communities are lagging. We need better support for children's social and emotional well-being. We can do this by providing access to quality services, as well as strengthening the links between schools, community, and health services. And finally, we need to address the impacts of the cost of living crisis to ensure that all children have equal opportunities to participate in their learning, whilst cost of living is challenging for most families. The cost of housing, food, petrol, and extracurricular activities make it even harder for low-income families to get children to school and the things they need. And sorry, this is the final area. Equitable foundations in the ECEC system. We need to ensure universal and quality access for all Australian children, regardless of where they live or what their background may be. Our report also has a spotlight topic. It highlights the persistent inequalities in inequities in access to quality education, particularly to children from disadvantaged backgrounds, First Nation communities, and remote areas. Compounding these challenges is the digital divide, a crucial issue Australia increasingly embraces technology in education. So this brings us to our spotlight topic of the learning paper and the subject of our panel discussion for today, the digital divide and generative AI in learning. Unlike the children we work with today, most of us can remember a time before smartphones, when mobile phones were only used to make calls. And this means that a lot of this tech is still pretty new to us. So what does generative AI mean? Generative AI is a subset of AI that uses machine learning to discover patterns and structure from training data, and then use this to generate new data which has similar characteristics. Generative AI can generate new content such as text, images, audio, and video that resembles what humans can produce. It's effective at recognizing patterns in video, audio, text, and images and emulating them when tasked with producing something. This means that AI holds immense potential to revolutionize education by supporting personalized learning, improving access to resources, and amplifying educators' abilities. However, it also poses risks, especially for children already facing barriers to education due to socioeconomic and geographical factors, as well as concerns surrounding safety and privacy. To realise the benefits of generative AI, we should seek to improve digital connectedness for all children, particularly those in rural and remote areas, and for vulnerable families with limited economic resources. Therefore, UNICEF Australia and ARACY support extensive ongoing consultation with children and young people to uncover creative child-led solutions and insights with respect to their education and the use of generative AI, as well as any unintended consequences. A commitment to a strong research agenda to understand the potential risks of generative AI, as well as to evaluate its use in educational settings and the reasons for its rapid uptake. This research should also include disadvantaged and marginalised groups and consider the different educational needs of each school age cohort. We need sustainable solutions to the digital inclusion challenges of families that allow family members to fully participate in society, and specifically children and young people to fully engage in and participate in their education and learning journeys. So, to further consider the opportunities and potential challenges with the emergence of AI in education and learning, I'm pleased to introduce to you today our panel. We have Dr. Kelly Stevens, Director of EdTech and Education Policy at UTS, the Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion, and Cyril Sargi and Jules Gabor, both UNICEF Australia Young Ambassadors. Welcome. So welcome, Kelly, Cyril and Jules. Thanks for joining us today and agreeing to share your expertise. So to begin with, can I ask each of you, starting with Kelly, to give us a little bit of a brief introduction, who you are, where you're from, what you do, and with one word, what your relationship status with AI currently is.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I'm Kelly Stevens. I'm joining you actually from UTS at the moment, and so therefore I am on Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to Aboriginal elders past and present. At UTS, I have the great pleasure of working with Professor Leslie Lobel. We convene a group called the Australian Network for Quality Digital Education, which brings together industry, the education sector, philanthropy, social benefit, government, with the shared objective of making sure that AI and EdTech help tackle the question, the pressing problem of educational inequity, and don't make it worse. My relationship status with AI, what would I say? I'd say non-exclusive.
Very good. Thank you, Kelly. Cyril, I'll hand over to you next.
Hi guys, thank you all for having me here today as well. I'm really excited to have this conversation. I think it's a really important conversation to be having. My name is Cyril. I'm a fifth-year medical student. I'm also a young ambassador with UNICEF Australia. And previously I've held roles in medical education with the Australian Medical Students Association and as an advisor for the South Australian Mental Health Commission. So this is such an important conversation, and I think it impacts so many areas of our lives, and I think particularly the education of young children. And so I think I'm really excited to hear from all the other hosts and yeah, have a really broad conversation about this topic.
Cyril, what would you say your relationship status with AI is in one word?
Ooh, I think I'd say hopeful.
Hopeful. Great. Thank you. And Jules.
Hi, I'm super excited to be here as well. My name is Jules. I'm 19 and I'm from Larrakia country, so I'm joining up from Darwin, the Northern Territory. I'm a UNICEF Young Ambassador this year, but also in Darwin, I work alongside a lot of youth committees and stuff like that. I work with a lot of organizations and help amplify the voices of young people. So education and the systems within it are really important to me and something I hold close to my heart as someone who's just graduated from high school. And my relationship status with AI is probably, I'm going to say changing. I'd probably say changing, yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone. So we've got a lot of questions that we've already been working on to try and narrow our discussion because we just had so much to talk about and we've only got such a short period of time. So I'm going to start off with probably the most easy introduction of what has been your experience or observation in how the digital divide can affect student learning outcomes. And I might start with you, Cyril, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So my relationship with the digital divide has been quite interesting, and I think particularly in the context of like AI technology. I've been a tutor for the past 5 or 6 years, so I tutor in person and online, and I think I've been able to recognize how technology can be a really useful tool to support learning, and particularly remote learning has been something that has been very useful for me, reaching out to students in rural and remote communities who might not otherwise be able to have in-person support like that. And so in that sense, I've seen it be very useful, but I think I'm also very cognizant of the fact that there is a strong digital divide. I think currently almost a quarter of Australians are digitally excluded. And so I think what that means is almost a quarter of Australians unable to access or utilize technology to the best of their potential and to help them support their lives. So I think when it comes to education, the digital divide is also something that has the potential to worsen the barriers of entry to education and can potentially also worsen the educational outcomes of young children. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that a digital divide exists just beyond the context of AI, because I think that contextualizes this issue and the barriers that could potentially expand upon the concerns we already have about implementing AI into our education system. So yeah.
Excellent. Jules, would you like to follow on?
Yeah, of course. As a young person who's just graduated from high school in a more regional area, I will say that there are absolutely there is a digital divide. And being from Darwin, I'm not from the most remote area of the Northern Territory, and we still do have access issues. Compared to people interstate, we don't have the same access to digital spaces or technology, and students miss out on those opportunities due to a lack of resources. But it also just comes back to that access. I have seen how AI, if we're coming back to AI, how it does support young people when they don't have that support in person, if they're really struggling with having that connection, because a lot of young people do rely on that connection with their teachers, with their tutors, with anyone higher up. Sometimes young people do falter with that and don't have that connection, so they do turn to digital spaces like the internet and AI. But I do also see that in my community that we don't want AI to turn into that teacher. We don't want that to become the new form of how young people are learning. And I do see how it has started to affect student learning outcomes just due to that reliance. And I guess the next question is like how we continue to kind of move on forward from that. But that's kind of my experience in the NT, yeah.
Thank you. And Kelly, would you be able to share your experience and observations with us?
Yes, and I'd like to build on something Cyril said and then also something Jules said. So, Cyril, you talked about remote learning, and I think one of the things that in the education sector that really brought home the impact of the digital divide on student learning was COVID. And I noticed in the report that's come out that you also mentioned climate and other disasters. Like, I think we kind of forget about COVID a little bit now. It feels a bit in the past, but the discontinuity of learning that it revealed, or rather maybe I'd say the challenge in maintaining continuity of learning for kids is something that we should keep working on, because it may not be our last experience of that kind, and we should be working to get it right. I mean, that really brought it home to us. We had some kids, some schools where it was just like they flicked a switch and they all, instead of going to school, they went to their bedroom and they looked at all of the lessons for the day on their big computers. And, yes, it was still stressful, and yes, it was still different and difficult, but learning went on. And then you had children in other circumstances where maybe there was 1 or 2 phones to go between 4 or 5 kids, and you had teachers who were driving around hard copy packets of materials because there was no internet connectivity. So I think the way in which, in those cases, the digital divide affects the learning outcome is through affecting the opportunity to learn. We know that if you fall behind, so if it's hard for you to finish assignments or homework and you fall behind, it's going to be really hard to catch up. To go to Jules's point, and Jules called out, I think, this really fascinating question at the moment, which is, around the use of the large language model chatbots for learning. And I think there is huge potential there. There's certainly a lot of people investing a lot of time and effort. What I think, and absolutely we should embrace it, we should understand it. What I think we also should be mindful about is that also it has the potential to play into disadvantage. So there have been a couple of really interesting studies. I won't bore everybody with lots of research here, but there have been a couple of interesting studies that are worth thinking about. One was a large Turkish study where they experimented and they either gave kids no help. It was secondary school, it was maths. They either gave kids no help apart from the textbook, in practicing their math solutions, or one of 2 generative AI chatbots. One was basically like ChatGPT and the other was a bit more educationally oriented. And then they looked at the difference it made. And in the case of practice sessions, the kids did way better with the chatbots, and that was good. But when it came to having to answer questions without the assistance, they did worse. They did worse than the kids that hadn't had them, particularly for the generative, the kind of one that was most like ChatGPT. And then there's another study which was Harvard, and it was first year, I'm going to get the science wrong now, first year physics. There were 200 kids, and again, they didn't experiment. Some kids just went to their tutor as normal, and the others had an AI kind of chat tutor, and they did it in their dorm. And they found out that the kids in that circumstance using the AI, they learnt more and they learnt it faster and they enjoyed it more. But what is worth remembering there is that these tools had been very carefully constructed. They'd been programmed with the right answers. They didn't hallucinate. There were a lot of safeguards in it, and also the kids had to do it. It was structured. It was proctored, so people were watching what they did. And we know that in order to engage with these tools, it can skew towards being advantage. You need usually to have more background knowledge. You usually need to be quite self-motivated. That often requires having certain family supports, all of which is just to say heaps of potential, but we need to keep our eye on it.
Excellent. So we've already started to touch on generative AI, and Jules, your comments have got a lot of love in the chat. People saying thanks for confirming that you don't want AI to be your teacher. So flowing on from that point, I think it flows in quite well to our next question. With the rise of generative AI, do you think that it's going to impact on critical thinking and research skills? And I might hand over to Kelly first.
Okie doke. Yeah, it's a great question. And I would say that, across commentators, the jury's out. I do worry, because historically when we've been through big changes, and big changes like the agricultural revolution and industrial revolution, we've seen what a lot of commentators would call skill shedding. So, once we don't all need to be out in the fields growing our food or sewing our clothes, lots of us, and I'm talking at this kind of society level, lots of us forget how to do those things. And that was okay as long as there were more things to learn to do instead. And the things to learn to do instead were knowledge work. And that's why they talk about the knowledge economy. And so the trickiness with AI is that if we give up the knowledge work, where else are we going to go? So I think that we need to just think very carefully about AI and retaining our sense of agency with it. Now, I think part of the solution to that, and it's perhaps counterintuitive, is that we need to make sure that kids continue to build really strong foundations like reading and writing and numeracy. And I actually had the opportunity to hear Sal Khan of Khan Academy and Khan Amigo fame recently, and he was asked a similar question, and he said, well, actually, if we're going to hang out with the machines as they get cleverer and cleverer, the 3 R's are going to be more important now than ever. So I think it's also important to pay attention to intrinsic motivation. We're going to have to, as educators and as a society, convince kids of the value of learning things, doing things, learning how to do things from scratch that a machine might already be able to do quicker than they can. But at that moment in their learning, it's important that they know how to write the paragraph or think through the mathematical problem. And intrinsic motivation, it's kind of the philosopher's stone of education, you know. But we do know that it's strongest when students have teachers that they feel believe in them and that they have a strong connection with. So I guess the positive side is that in all the good teachers out there, we've got something good to build on.
Great. And I'm just going to throw to Cyril in a minute, but I just want to remind our participants joining us today, please pop any questions that you have for the panel that you'd like to discuss in the chat box or the Q&A feature. But just flowing on from that discussion on self-directed learning and being able to have that intrinsic motivation. I know when we spoke in preparation for the webinar, Cyril, you talked about your experience of using it to support your learning in your studies. Are you able to share a little bit of your experience on that?
So although I look quite young, I graduated high school in 2018, and at that point, AI technology wasn't really a part of the conversation when it came to completing assessments and, you know, submitting tasks. And so, as most of you are probably familiar with, you know, when we had to write an essay, it probably took us 3, 4, 5 hours to, you know, look through information, synthesize points, and then, you know, construct an essay. And now things have shifted as I've moved through university. If I need to write an essay, it's one input away and then maybe 20, 30 minutes of editing. And I think whilst that's convenient, what I've been reflecting on is that as I've kind of pursued tertiary education, it's been a pursuit of passion and it's been something that I've been interested in. And so it's been interesting to reflect on the idea of how do I use this technology in a way that supports that pursuit of learning and you know, enhances that experience, and how do I stop it from compromising it, even though it provides convenience, even though it provides a lot of support. And I think that's also really important, or particularly important when we talk about younger kids, and particularly in that K to 12 population. A quote I've been really thinking about recently was the idea that kids need to learn to read before they can read to learn. And I think that's something that's like so important, and it really underpins this issue that we have with AI, and that statistics have shown that, like, you know, ChatGPT and generative AI platforms have a lot of inbuilt biases. They have issues with, you know, providing a balanced perspective. And as learners that have had the opportunity to live in a world that has been free from these tools, we're able to look at that information and kind of critically analyze it, reflect on biases, think about what sort of perspectives we need to be considering. But if young children grow up in an education system where this is the norm, do we compromise that skill development? And I think maybe, as Kelly had said, there is an issue with introducing generative AI at a very young age, and maybe we do need to be focusing on ensuring that kids do have those critical thinking skills before they're able to engage with it. And I think developing those skills will only help young people engage better with this technology and utilize it in a way that enhances their learning as opposed to hindering it. So yeah, I think it's a really fine balance and something that we need to be focusing on. So yeah.
Excellent. So we've got a question that I'm actually going to throw to Jules as our most recent school leaver. What sort of perspective was your experience that teachers had of generative AI in use? Do you think they saw it as sort of something like they were worried that it was going to be used to cheat? Do you think that they were unfamiliar with it? It would be great if you can share your recent experience.
Yeah, of course. When I was in school, AI was definitely antagonized. I remember getting sat down into big classrooms and the teachers being like, we know when you use AI, don't use AI, all of these things, and basically telling us not to use it at all. And I've heard from other students who are still in school and stuff like that, telling them that they don't have that same approach. It's not don't use AI, it's bad, but don't use AI to write your entire essay. Don't use it to write big chunks and don't rely on it, which I think is quite interesting because they had this banal kind of perspective on it, and a lot of students got caught for using it to write their whole essays, and that is the problem. And I think when students use AI compared to like learning from a teacher, learning from a human, AI doesn't have the experience in life like a teacher does, like a human itself does. And I think when I was in school, a lot of people were like, oh my gosh, like I actually have to do the work now. But in actuality, when we sit behind like a teacher or someone who's trying to lead and like teach people, it's that experience and it's that understanding behind what you're teaching and what you're learning about that really sets it apart from AI. And I think that being 1 year out from school and reflecting and learning about and also being in an adulting in life now, I understand completely where they've been coming from. That teachers don't want that AI to be that main point. Like AI can be helpful, but also we don't want it to be that main thing that young people grapple on to write essays, to develop structure, to do everything with, because as Kelly and Cyril were talking about before, those skills are really, really important. We need to have those skills to go through day-to-day life, and they need to be learned from the ground up. Like, and there's true value from learning from scratch as well.
So reflecting on skills, but moving more towards our educators' skills, do you think that they're getting enough training and support to be able to utilize these new technologies with children to be able to deliver learning outcomes for children that enhance how to use the tools? Do you think our educators are being anxious about the introduction of technology?
That's like a really good question. I think as a student and someone who has like gone on to talk to their teachers after school as well, there is that kind of uncertainty with how AI kind of is acting alongside learning and education and stuff like that. I think more on AI is an like ever-changing arena. Like there are new things that are getting introduced to it and new aspects that people haven't known about before. And I guess that from my perspective as a student and also as someone who's just graduated, I guess that everyone needs to learn, even students, and I'm sure teachers are also learning alongside that. And I think any support in both arenas, helping young people understand how AI works, but also helping teachers and those educators understand that as well, and also helping them navigate it, because the digital space is ever changing. It's not the same one day to another. And I think that support and learning and definitely resources absolutely need to be developed to help support both the students and the teachers be able to navigate those spaces safely and be able to help each other.
Kelly, do you have something? Yeah, thank
I
you.
was just going to jump in because I think Jules hit the nail on the head when she talked about the speed of change. And I've noticed that one of the comments was, does that promote anxiety? Well, I know for me, like when things are changing very, very quickly, yes, it promotes, totally promotes anxiety. I think that and AI and technology is one domain in which there's a lot of change for teachers, but there's lots of other areas in which they're also experiencing, to varying degrees, a lot of change. I mean, you see reports about changing expectations of what schools can deliver, and the kind of gaps in children's experiences and supports that some schools in particular may be asked to stand in for, some teachers in particular may be asked to stand in for. And I think the challenge when things are changing so fast is we can't provide new professional learning every minute on the new thing. So what is a sustainable model that addresses that does give educators the support that they need? One of the things that I've heard a fair bit in talking with teachers about this is that they don't necessarily want professional learning of the type that we maybe use it for other things. And there may be lots of value in that type as well, but they often talk about wanting time to play and they often use exactly that word, play, or to experiment with their colleagues. And I think that makes so much sense. But time is really hard to find in schools, and it's harder to find. We should always remember it's an equity issue as well. It's harder to find in some schools than in other schools. So in schools that might have a larger proportion of families that are facing various challenges, we also know those schools might have less experienced teachers, more difficulties filling a teacher vacancy, particularly maybe where that teacher vacancy is maths or science or technology and applied studies. They might struggle to get casual teachers, and all of those things make it harder to find the time to play and to experiment with technology. And then you've got a non-metropolitan setting, for example, where if you're going to do something in person, you might have to travel a long distance. So the time required gets even more. I think schools and teachers are very resourceful. So I've spoken to people who find ways to explore and experiment regardless. But I do think it's a very rapidly changing space, as Jules said. And yes, we're going to have to think quite intentionally about how we best support people in that circumstance.
Thank you, Kelly. Cyril, I'm just wondering, with your experience working with or tutoring with students who are in various locations and geographical areas and from varied backgrounds, what do you think their experience has been in terms of the support given by their educator to use these technology?
I think something that I've seen across the students that I've taught, and they, come from various socioeconomic backgrounds, various geographical locations. And so there are a lot of variables at play that impact the way in which they can be supported. And I've noticed that, whether it comes to constraints with teachers being able to support one-to-one education, or whether it's schools not being able to provide, technology or iPads or computers, there are so many barriers that impact a person's ability to engage with their schoolwork. And so one thing that I've also noticed is that there is a great benefit from using technology, and particularly generative AI technology, on platforms such as Khan Academy are very useful. And a lot of parents that I've spoken to have found that these platforms that use generative AI have been incredibly supportive for their children's learning, as they can provide so much data, so much knowledge about, the areas of weakness that their children might have, how they learn, what kind of supports that they require. And that data can be really useful for teachers to, support the way in which they deliver education. So I think it's unfortunate that we haven't invested enough in the professional development of teachers, because there's so many ways in which generative AI can be utilized. And I think if used effectively, can very much help address those issues with inequity. And particularly, I think when I think about a classroom, right, like in any one classroom, there is such a broad spectrum of skills and capabilities and the type of support that children need. And so tools like Khan Academy that have AI features are able to create information that can be really useful for teachers to better understand what children need and how they can better serve those kids. So a lot to think about in terms of opportunity, but that opportunity can only really be accessed if we provide the kind of funding, support, and professional development opportunities that teachers require.
We've got lots of people jumping in the chat with comments like, you know, higher order thinking skills are essential, and being able to synthesize the information that you're getting from these tools and techniques is really important. So knowing that students are digital natives and they've been immersed in technology for most of their life, do you think that they know how to use it safely and effectively, particularly for learning? Or anyone want to jump in?
I think it's a really kind of nuanced idea. I think just because you're familiar with this technology, I don't think it necessarily makes you literate or be better equipped to navigate all the kind of challenges and potential threats and dangers that come with technology like generative AI. We know that there is so much knowledge capturing, and there is such a great potential for, you know, the data and information surrounding users of generative AI to be used by companies and these platforms. So there is a lot of danger, particularly for that, you know, K-12 population who may be vulnerable. And so I think the assumption that being a, you know, tech native, you know, insulates kids from the potential harms of technology is a really naive thing. And so I think we do need to make sure that we have policies, whether that's at the school level, the state level, or even the federal level, to ensure that we put in the necessary restrictions or kind of establish guidelines on how children should be utilizing these platforms within the education system is really important.
Kelly or Jules, do either of you have anything to add on to that point?
I just noticed a comment in the chat that digital native might be digital native for social media, not basic computer skills, and that is something that I've heard people talk about. The example that I've heard from completely different sources, completely different contexts, is kids not knowing where the different bits of information go in an email format, not being able to use email. But I'm also thinking of, we have the NAPLAN assessments, and everybody knows about the reading and numeracy assessments in particular. But every so often, about every 4 years, give or take, they also do an ICT literacy assessment. And the last one was 2022, and fewer than half of the Year 10 students attained a proficiency
Wow,
level.
that's so interesting.
Now, it's not all the kids like the reading and writing ones are. It's a sample of kids, but it's a large sample and it's a representative sample. And so if you use that as a benchmark of digital literacy, the answer would be no. But I think that assessment does go largely to those more traditional computer skills. But yeah, it's telling.
Particularly if you think about it being in 2022, after so much learning was done digitally, that's so surprising. I've not heard that a statistic. Thanks for sharing, Kelly. So moving on a little bit, I want to look at Target 17 in closing the gap. The national agreement has, by 2026, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will have equal access of digital inclusion. So I'm just wondering, I'd like you each to share your experiences with any initiatives that would give First Nations students the ability to access new educational technology, or any experiences in the ways that it's being used culturally safe and enriching for First Nations people. Kelly, would you like to jump in first?
I will, although I would preface this by saying that I've had the privilege of speaking to people from 2 different organisations which are doing amazing things with First Nations people, by First Nations people in the area of technology and learning. they're not my organisations, and I'm conscious that other people would speak with greater authority about them, but I'm very happy to describe them briefly. So one is called the Living First Languages platform, which is an initiative that is trying to do at least two things at once. And I think it's so clever. So its intent is to help communities, and it's all about being community driven, collate language information, but the format in which it's done, the web-based application that this information is collated and organised and shared in, is designed to support early literacy for children in that community. So basically you bring together the elders in a community that have detailed knowledge of the language, but maybe not as much knowledge about technology, and younger people in the community who might be more confident, at least, with technology, but not as fluent in language. And you're using this application to serve both ends and also to build parenting confidence as first educators. Like, I think it's great, such a great example. It's also done with regard to data sovereignty. So First Nations communities make decisions, all the decisions about the permissions they own, all the data, very built very well from the ground up. And then another First Nations owned and run organisation called In Digital, which bring together kind of advanced technologies like virtual reality, AI, augmented reality, and building people's knowledge about First Nations culture. So they simultaneously seek to build cultural knowledge and technological knowledge in ways that also bridge the gap, particularly for non-Indigenous teachers who might feel less comfortable talking about either cultural material in the syllabus or indeed technology. So again, another example where it's trying to do a number of things and bring them all together in very thoughtful ways.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing those resources. Someone's just, Adam from my team has popped in the link to Living First Languages in the chat for people that are interested in taking a look closer at the work that they're doing, which is wonderful. So just going to take a moment to have a quick scroll through the chat. Don't forget, if you've got any questions and you're burning to ask them, pop them in. We've got a few minutes left to this webinar. So just having a look here, lots of people agreeing with all the content today, and really thankful for the thought-provoking discussion, which is great.
Can I just pop in, Liz, while you just
Please.
to make the observation that if we're thinking about generative AI and First Nations, that generative AI is more than on record for having a fair bit of bias in it, and the kind of large language models that underpin it have been described as weird, which is a social research term that stands for Western, what does it stand for? Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, and we can add white and we can add male to that. So First Nations communities, but also many other communities might have complicated relationships with generative AI for those reasons.
Wonderful. So we are getting close to wrapping up, but I would just like to ask Cyril, starting with you first and then following on with Jules, if you can share with us what you think how you see AI working in the future.
That's a big question. I think even just in the past 2 years, we've seen how, from being something that was almost unheard of, AI technology has become a significant part of the way in which young people and, everyday learners use or engage with their education. And I think just going on the past 2 years, it's pretty safe to say that it will become an even bigger part of our learning experience. And if we use it and are able to harness its capabilities to support education, I think it's such a beneficial tool and has the potential to close some of those divides that we see in educational outcomes across different populations. So that's something that we really should be kind of working towards. But in order to do that, again, we need to be addressing those underlying differences and discrepancies that exist, whether that's funding, whether that's access to technology, whether that's providing culturally sensitive and appropriate learning resources. All of those foundational aspects still need to be addressed in order for us to better and more effectively engage with AI. So yeah, I think it's great to see what's going to happen in the next few years, and hopefully, we are ready for it.
I'll go next. I think that AI is an ever-changing landscape, especially in the education scene. It's the way it's been viewed has changed for me within the last year, and in the future, it's on. I agree with Cyril and everything that's been said in regards to making sure we have that foundation and making sure that access is there, because it's something that is going to provide a lot of opportunity for lots of people. But in order for that opportunity to be fruitful, we need to be able to ensure that we have policies and ways that we can access it safely and make sure that it's being used properly as well, ethically. So, yeah.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask each of you as our wrap-up question. If you were speaking to the Prime Minister and you had one thing that you could offer to them as what you think would be most effective in addressing the digital divide in education, what would that be? So let's start with Kelly. You've got the Prime Minister's ear. What's the one thing you say?
The one thing I would say is don't make it just about the devices. The devices are necessary but not sufficient. And if we don't attend to the layers of what we might call the digital inclusion stack on top of that, the skills to use it, and also the knowledge and skills to put it to beneficial outcomes, the use to beneficial outcomes, then the devices won't deliver. You won't close that digital divide.
Wonderful, thank you. Jules, what's the one thing that you would say to the Prime Minister to help with the digital divide?
I think that there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around AI and a lot of the digital space. And I think I would probably tell them to start the conversation, start going into communities and start asking the really important questions. And just start the conversation and invite people to share their thoughts as well. Make it a two-way conversation. Don't make it a one-way stream. I think we need to open up that chance.
Wonderful. And finally, Cyril.
I think like with everything, a diversity of perspective when it comes to having these conversations is so important. Like we all know that the inner city student is learning differently to the student that's learning in a classroom in a remote part of Australia. And so without all of those perspectives, without all of those experiences, we can't tailor our policies and develop initiatives for AI technology in the school system. And it won't be effective. So that diversity of perspective, I think, is the most important thing.
That is such good advice.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Kelly, Cyril and Jules. It has been a wonderful discussion. We've had lots of really thankful comments in the chat, people who've really enjoyed it, lots of food for thought. So thank you very much. The recording of today's session will be available in the coming week on ARACY's website and YouTube channel, and we'll share the links in the ARACY newsletter. If you aren't already subscribed, please do so. I've just popped the link to the subscribe to the ARACY newsletter in the chat box, which popped in now, and then you'll be updated with future webinars as well as knowing when the recording is ready. So on that note, thank you very much. We hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists, and we look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar. Thank you.